Yep, it's live now.
Good. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our third session of EconTEAching on improving employability for economics students. I am Ramin Nasehi, a teaching fellow at the Department of Economics at UCL. Our topic is very topical today. Unfortunately, the recent corona crisis has made the issue of employability one of the top concerns for our students and graduates. And for this topic, we couldn't wish for better speakers. Both of them have considerable experience on the both sides of the fence. On the one hand, academia, and on the other hand, public and private sectors. Our first speaker is Dean Garrett. Hello, Dean.
Hello, Ramin. Hello, everyone.
Dean is a senior teaching fellow at Austin Business School and also a senior fellow of Higher Education Academy. Dean has had the experience of working for Treasury and the Council of Mortgage Lenders. He has been the academic assessor for Government Economic Services, and he has run many sessions for Treasury's Graduate Development Program on policy design and macroeconomics. Our second speaker is Clodagh Jenkins. Hello, Clodagh.
Morning, everyone.
Clodagh is a principal teaching fellow at the Department of Economics at UCL and also a senior fellow of Higher Education Academy. Since 1997, Clodagh has been providing consultancy and training to many utility companies. She has also been the head of Ofgem's review of energy network regulations between 2008 and 2010. So as you can see, both of our speakers have ample experience in the world of employability, unlike me and many of my colleagues who have never left school. So before starting the session, let me talk about the format of our seminar today. I'm gonna have a Q&A session with two of our speakers for 20 minutes. I'm gonna ask them three general questions in order to contextualize and ask them to give us the big picture. Then I will open up the floor for Q&As from the audience. We already received many good questions from you. I try to pick and choose depending on how the conversation progresses. Now, in the last 5 minutes, I'll return to our speaker and ask them to gather their thoughts on the topic. So, enough of me, let me pose the first question. Why should we bother thinking about employability skills when designing a degree or a module? Dean, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I think I'm going to draw on, if this is okay with everyone, a bit of my own background and experience. As you said, I had the very good fortune for 3 going on 4 years of working for the Treasury and the Council of Mortgage Lenders, who now go by the name UK Finance. And I remember my very first day at the Treasury. And in fact, many of us who've worked outside academia and indeed within academia, or even done placement visits, will know what I mean when I say the very first task I was asked to do was to download data in Excel and then prepare a briefing. Now I thought, crikey, I thought I had reasonable subject knowledge, but in terms of skills around particularly applying and communicating economic ideas, I don't think I was sufficiently prepared. And I don't know how the rest feel, but I hear that constantly from graduates, not just of economics, but more generally, actually. So for me, it was the sense of not perhaps being as prepared, particularly in terms of skills and competencies like application and communication. And then when I went back, and again, I have been out of school, as you put it. When I went back, I think I fell immediately back into the trap of doing what I'd done when I first started out in academia. So I don't want to suggest that the light bulb immediately went back on, you know, when I found myself back in academia. I think it took a while before it dawned on me that I was doing what I think is done to a lot of traditional economists, a very technical, a very mathematical sort of training. And I was doing that again. And I was often getting students come to me saying they weren't enjoying their economics. I think that was another observation I will make. And I think what happened is there is this myth. You talked, Ramin, we had a sort of little talk, didn't we, last week about the sort of myths that can come around employability. And I think there's a myth that there is this sort of separation between subject knowledge, application and communication. I'm going to pick on those three for the reason that the GES, the Government Economic Service, identify those as key competencies of professional economists. But I think those three competencies, I know this is Claude is very aware that we need to make sure that this isn't just about training professional economists, it's more than that. But these three competencies, rather than sort of being in little silos, I think there's some really neat synergies going on between these three competencies of knowledge, application and communication. And I think if you go, I would say to anyone, go and have a read of the GES website, particularly the information they give candidates. Okay, and they spell out really quite neatly what these synergies are, and that to develop a really deep knowledge of something, again, this is a little trick you can do with students, actually getting them to intuitively communicate, write for different audiences, explain for different audiences. These are really key skills. And so, as I say, my experience was that eventually that light bulb did go on, that down the line I suddenly thought, actually the way to really deepen students' knowledge and also have this sort of, I love might be too strong a word for 10 past 11 on a whatever day of the week it is, because with lockdown you do forget what day of the week it is, don't you? But I think a love of economics is about understanding that economics is more than just mechanics, it's more than just method. And I think actually what happens is academic training concentrates a lot on the method and forgets the importance of combining method with application and communication. I think one other thing as to why it's really important. Many of our students, very few of them, will actually go on and have careers either as academic or even indeed professional economists. But I would suggest to you that these skills that I've put under very generic headings of application and communication, they have broad appeal, broad relevance in a multitude of different careers. I was watching the press briefing last night. I don't know if anyone else saw the briefing last night. And that was quite an interesting experience when the scientist spoke. She had a series of charts and graphs, and it took me back to one of the presentations I had to do very early on when I worked for the Treasury, which was to communicate ideas out of a chart in a way that was reasonably well understood by a variety of different audiences. And it's not easy. Okay, it's not easy. And I did smile when I was watching last night this scientist struggle somewhat to display an ability to communicate straightforwardly. And I said that was my final thing, and it's typical of an academic to mean that was almost my final thing. But what I would say is I think that the word employability can be quite frightening and can be a little bit off-putting because it's one of those generic words we have, isn't it? And actually what you need to do is to dissect that word, and actually we need to get greater buy-in from our colleagues by better understanding what we mean by employability. So I'm sure Clodagh will talk about what she understands by employability and why it's important, but I sometimes think the word itself can be a wee bit off-putting. So for me, it's my personal experience, my journey, that really has taught me that employability is incredibly important. So perhaps pass over to Clodagh at this point.
Yeah, and I think I mean, we've got very similar stories, but I think the point, so my experience comes from interviewing a lot of people, particularly in economic consultancy, where I guess the expectations are you have really high-end economics knowledge, plus you can communicate it to non-economists. And I interviewed so many people with first-class degree predictions or masters or even PhDs who I just kept rejecting because they couldn't explain themselves in interview. And I ended up feeling really sorry for these kids because they really didn't know where they were going wrong. They'd ask for feedback and they just didn't understand it. So I think, one of the reasons why developing skills, and I agree with Dean, I sort of have a passionate hatred for the word employability, and it's not something I ever heard until I came into academia. But I certainly heard about training and developing skills. Is I think our students deserve this. I think they deserve to be prepared well for the labour market or even for graduate study. I think the skills they need for graduate study aren't that different in some ways, partly because of the huge fees they're paying. They deserve a return on that, but also because they put a huge amount of effort into this and into their career planning. And I think they deserve to get what they need, which might be, I'm just going to share my screen and hopefully this will work. So last year I did a study with the Economics Network looking at what the skills are that students might need. And Dean already emphasized the first two, which is communication, application to the real world. And what we did was we asked employers, we asked economics departments what they were prioritizing, and then we looked at graduate outcomes and what employers were saying they thought graduates didn't have. So by wider skills are these kind of softer employability skills like resilience and flexibility. But the sort of main message from the study, or part of it, was the top 3 skills that employers look for and that departments say they're focusing on aren't that different. A little bit of, not surprisingly, economics departments are very focused on the data analysis. But the skill that departments say they're putting most focuses on is the one that employers think these students don't have when they graduate. So, for example, communication. This is a high level of concern for employers. Application to the real world is a medium level of concern, and this is partly a much higher level of concern for employers who are working as economists than those who aren't, I guess. And then with data analysis, we're putting all our effort into it, but actually the type of data analysis we teach is not the main thing that employers are looking for. And then things like team working, resilience, flexibility. And I think one of the questions we had in advance was around, do we think the skills are changing in a COVID world? And I'm sure we all know that probably every interview that happens in the next 2 years is going to have a question about how did you cope with COVID? How resilient were you during COVID? I think the softer skills have always become increasingly important. And Dean's example of the scientific advisor yesterday is a really good example of the research that's going on that shows, particularly for something like big data, data science, actually the more you get into data, the more important it is that you can communicate it and that you can work with people from different disciplines on it. So I think the skills have already started changing in that the communication, the softer skills are increasingly more important. But I think, it's only fair to our students to focus a bit more on this. We'll talk in a little bit about how to do it. I think the other thing that I found, and it wasn't something I expected coming to a university like UCL, is actually how little students have these skills coming out of school. And I think providing support with skills can be a real leveler for different communities. So, I tend to teach modules where we do a lot of practical stuff. I tend to get the not most talented academic students coming to my modules. So they're not the ones who do the best in the exams, but they tend to do well in my modules. So having mixed approaches to teaching and assessment can help different groups of students. Also, have a student who just about scraped a 2-2 in first year, went on placement, came back so confident in themselves, so focused on what they wanted to do. And we obviously haven't had their exams yet, but I am so sure he's going to nail it this year. So getting these experiences, they can just help the confidence of these students, I think. I'll be the first to say they don't like it. They don't like working in teams. They don't necessarily like presenting in a classroom, but, they don't actually get these opportunities, particularly, I guess the widening participation type students who in their schools, maybe they don't, even their teachers may not have the confidence to teach some of this stuff. So if we can do anything to level the playing field for these guys going into the job market and boy, are they going to be going into a tight job market now. So the more we can do on this, the better, I think. And I think, we're going to talk about it in a minute, but there is lots going on in economics about how to do this. And we just have to get better at sharing it, I guess.
Thank you. I think you both talked about why should we care about employability skill, this inappropriate world, and what have been the obstacles? What have been the pushbacks that you faced, both of you, when you were arguing for incorporating employability skills? What have been the obstacles? Dean, would you like to go first?
I think one of the key obstacles is often our own training, our own backgrounds. I think a lot of us are taught in, as I said earlier, in this very traditional way, and we often feel very comfortable in that environment. So I think part of it is our own training. I suppose it's like a form of hysteresis. Our own histories inform, don't they, our own practice going forward. I'm sure that's absolutely true. I think also there is often, again, a misunderstanding about the role of things like application, communication, and the softer skills, and how they complement understanding. I sometimes think people put this false choice in front of us. It's either we give students subject knowledge, or we have to dilute that in some way and focus additionally on application communication.
Dean, give a concrete example.
Well, without naming institutions, I can draw on a particular experience where I was told very, very clearly, you teach the nuts and the bolts, you set them quite technical pieces to do, because this is what good economists do. Okay, and so part of it comes from the community, from management, from colleagues who I think perhaps are a little bit unsure about these other skills and competencies and how they can complement. So I think you can design, again, we're going to come on to this, I think you can design a curriculum, a set of activities where you don't need to be fearful that by trying to develop these other skills, it's necessarily the opportunity cost of diluting the knowledge. I think that's one of those myths. I mean, how often have we found ourselves in our own practice having to communicate ideas without having to use perhaps algebra or diagrams, and found it incredibly difficult. I think we've all been in that situation. And actually, that's a real test of how well you understand something. Equally, how many times have we found students uncomfortable if we change the context in which a question, an issue, a topic is set? And how many of us have had that sort of feedback? How dare you have changed the increase to a decrease in, I don't know, government spending when you were assessing something? So application is incredibly important. I think also we have to face the truth that there are institutional constraints on sometimes our ability to develop the curriculum in a way that would help to develop these employability skills. The number of times you will see a top-down approach, you will have this number of assessments in your curriculum. Your pieces must have this amount of words. In other words, you must have a menu of tariffs, if you've got a 15 or 20 credit point module. And what I'm saying is it can both stifle innovation in the way we deliver and assess our curriculum, but equally, I think what it has the danger of doing is adversely impacting on our ability to develop these wider skills. There are also other constraints. I would love to see all of my first years in a computer lab more often than they currently are, and not necessarily just in a statistics or quantitative module. So for instance, like Clodagh, I teach a lot of macroeconomics, and getting students comfortable with the act of getting their hands dirty with data, okay, and not having a fear of data from a very early stage, I think is incredibly important. So I think there are key institutional constraints, but I do think that even within them, we as academics do have to have the confidence and the belief in developing these other skills, and rid ourselves of that myth that developing application communication, data handling skills, getting students comfortable to use Excel or PowerPoint to work in groups, that does not have to come at the cost of subject knowledge. And just to repeat, I suppose this is almost my hashtag at the end, I think it's a false choice that we sometimes believe that is in front of us, to be honest with you, Remy.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more actually with Dean. I think, it might be worth pointing out, I have experience of this as a lecturer, but also as a program director. So trying to do stuff myself and also trying to persuade other people to do stuff. And I might focus a little bit more on the second one. So one thing, and it's also worth noting that I think there's just a huge variety across institutions and different types of institutions. So when we did the report for the Economics Network, there was a lot of differentiation between Russell Group and non-Russell Group in this area. And one of the reasons for that is if you take a university like UCL, we have no problem getting applications for our degree. We have no problem with graduate outcomes. Our students look like they're going out, and they are, 96% of them are going on to graduate level work or going on to graduate further study. So there's no real push from our institution to do this. Whereas I know in other institutions, there's a big push and this is their sales pitch. So that's one challenge, is getting, and you do need sort of senior buy-in to this in order to persuade other people to do things. As a module leader, when I came to UCL, I was quite surprised at how much I had to persuade our teaching committee to allow me to even just change my assessments, let alone change how I was teaching. Of course, the solution to that was to become the program director and then change how the teaching committee worked. But it's about, what we've already said. People just don't understand this area, and there's no pressure from above. So there's a real job for people who do understand it to explain to people why it's important. And I did learn what Dean was mentioning was the first thing you have to explain to people is this is not going to take you a huge amount more effort. This is not going to cost you a huge amount more resource. This is not going to dumb down what we're teaching. And again, that was something when I started teaching finalists, I thought, in the back of my head was, oh, this is UCL, top ranking university. I really need to teach technical material. And I teach incentive design stuff. But I do it through examples and I do it through pictures. And so many of my students go on to work in regulators and in competition authorities and come back and say, what you taught me was really useful. I'm actually using it day to day. And that's what you want. The other big elephant in the room is the ref. I think, most of us talking here are teaching fellows. We are teaching focused. If I was here in 2020 and I knew there was a ref coming up and that was what was going to determine my promotions, I would not want to put the effort into changing my courses at this point. And that's where I sat down with lecturers and really sort of looked at, well, what are you doing? What could you change slightly? And it's all about, how you teach and how you assess, not changing the content. So I think, recognizing that people have other demands in their times and incentivizing them is really important, but also incentivizing the students. So I'm also a careers tutor in our department, and students just never think of what they do in the classroom as good examples for their CV or for interviews. And that's a really big challenge, is explaining to them that these skills that we're teaching you are really important. They are transferable because, as Dean said, not all our students want to become like us. In fact, most of them don't want to be like us, but explaining to them, and again, being able to say to them in management consultancy or in investment banking or in retail, wherever they want to go, you're going to need to be able to write, you're going to need to be able to work with other people. But, communicating that with them is a big challenge, and persuading them is really important, I think. But I guess on a more positive note, it's worth putting in the effort and going for it. And I think certainly at UCL in economics at least, but still not institutional level, we have seen quite a big swing, not just amongst teaching fellows, but amongst colleagues. And I think once they see things happening and see that it's not rocket science, they get a bit more comfortable with it.
Before opening up to the floor, can I just ask this, quickly answer this question? Like, what are the low-hanging fruits? What are the easy things that we can do without institutional change, without cultural change? And could you give me bullet points, like 2 minutes each? Dean, would you go first?
I can address also one of the questions that's come up the chat room at the same time, Ramin, if we can kill two birds with one stone, because I see one of the questions is do we think the sort of COVID situation and the move to online teaching and assessment might actually cause us to be a little bit more innovative and actually in doing so address perhaps the employability gap that we're talking about. So I think simple things could be within, let's assume we've got an examination. So let's have a concrete example. Let's imagine we've got an examination. It is very straightforward to tweak that, perhaps to allow students to do something more akin to what professional economists do. So for instance, writing or creating economic briefing notes. So you could tweak that, and we've had to do that. That's why this question about COVID and the move to online, I had to do this because my exam had a multiple choice question. Well, if you've got a 24-hour takeaway examination, I think we'd all agree maybe multiple choice doesn't work terribly well. So sometimes the low-hanging fruit you're talking about here could be a little tweak of the assessment design, which might be focusing more on application and tailoring the assessment in that way to different audiences. So that's a relatively straightforward thing to do that wouldn't upset, because all universities and modules have to, don't they, conform to mod specs or UMDs as we call them at Aston. But I think that would be quite a relatively straightforward thing to do. So assessment design would be where I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, to use your phrase, Ramin.
I think for me, it's around I guess teaching and learning activities as well as assessment. Mm-hmm. So if you take the example of team working, I realized that our students weren't very good at talking to each other and collaborating with each other. So I started off really small in my modules by having what's called think, pair, share in lectures. So what we did was every so often I would just stop and put up a question, which was kind of like, right, we've done this model, how does that apply in the real world? And then I'd give them 5 minutes to talk to each other, because these are big classes. They didn't like talking out to the whole room, but they'd talk to their neighbor. Probably half the room went onto their phone and went onto Facebook and did something else, but there was enough engagement. I walk the room, check in on how they're doing. Then I built up into having group work in tutorials. So rather than them sort of having the TA or me presenting to them, there was designed activities for that. Now that did take a bit of effort and thinking about, well, where do I replace the answers to the homework and all of that. So I sort of practiced everything before I started assessing it, if that makes sense. And from sort of them getting used to that, then I had an assess group project, which was a case study project. So I think there's low-hanging fruit, and people are nervous about this stuff. They're not used to it. So I think giving that idea of do things not for credit, try something out, 1 tutorial out of 4, and just build up the confidence. I actually think more group teaching, more peer review, so people see each other doing this stuff, would be useful. And my only other piece of advice as a real bullet is, if you're really lacking confidence, try to bring in the alumni and the employers, because students do listen to them. So I had one student in a money and banking course who'd done an internship at the Financial Conduct Authority, and he was willing to speak to them about, because they were all complaining about writing essays and we want to be traders and we don't have to write essays. And he explained to them how everybody has to write, and what they have to write is a 1-page memo. It's not a 5,000-word dissertation, but it has to be concise and has to be accessible. And, hearing that from a peer was huge for them. It really made them sit up. So I think, obviously bringing in alumni from a few years ago is great, but if you've got students who've been on placement or they've got work experience, asking them to share their stories can be really valuable. And I think in the world of COVID, doing this on discussion forums and doing this in through other mechanisms could be really useful.
So let's open up the floor to Q&A. Can I ask all the participants to raise their hand if they have any questions? So we'll open up the mic so that they get a chance to address them. But so please raise your hands. In the meantime, let me pose this very interesting and very relevant question. Given the uncertain job market ahead, how do we best prepare our students to handle the situation? Now, can I ask you to give as specific as possible? Dean?
Oh, crikey, that's an easy question to answer, not. Thanks for that one, Ray. I think, look, clearly it's a challenging situation, but I think what this probably means is it's refocusing in our energies on the employability agenda. Because if I was to be, hopefully I'm not being too negative, I think actually this is an opportunity to re-energize this progression or development of the employability agenda. Because I think actually the employability gap is still significant. If you look at economic networks, surveys of employers, of graduates, the results are often very, you could almost read the report from 2 years earlier, Ramin. So I think this is an opportunity as much as anything to re-energize the employability agenda. I think in doing that, though, the disciplines need to have the confidence to take it almost in-house. I do worry that one of the challenges, and I think COVID-19 gives us an opportunity to look at this again, is I sometimes think the employability agenda is taken away from us by people further up the food chain, by management. And I think it's very important that as a community, an economics community, we get a greater sense of buy-in from our colleagues and a greater sense of what we can do. So I accept that the labour market is incredibly challenging. My argument would be that I don't think that we've actually got anywhere near tackling the employability agenda. And actually, maybe this is the opportunity, this is the sort of moment where we can actually drive this forward a lot more than we currently are doing. But I do think it needs the economics community or whatever discipline to take greater ownership and make sense of what that means for their discipline.
So I think my take on this is all quite Irish. I think it's fair to say, coming from a land of immigrants. When I graduated in '95, we were in an economic recession. 2 years later, Celtic Tiger started. So I like to have personal conversations with students like that, to explain to them that, this isn't the first crisis that people have had. I've lived through 708. I've seen, and for me, actually, this is where we emphasize the skills of flexibility and openness. So if your first choice of job just seems to be too difficult to go into, is there a different pathway to get to that? Is there a different route to do it? And I think, a lot of that's about career planning, but it helps if it can come from somebody who understands economics discipline a bit. Yes. And understands, because you can obviously, on the one hand, it's a tight labor market. On the other hand, my God, are people going to need good data analysis people and people who are bright and people who can do things? And, throw Brexit into the mix and there's going to be jobs for economists out there, but they may not be the ones that they originally thought of. So I think that's the conversations I'm having daily with students, because a lot of them are panicking. Of course they are. But also they just really struggle to think, day one has to be this. Actually, it's going to be something different. And I think helping them with that is quite important. And that's where, if through their degree, we've helped them understand, I'm coming out of this not as a central bank economist or not as a government economist. I'm coming out of this as somebody with good communication skills, all of the skills. If they understand that, then they'll feel more ready for what's out there. And can look at a random job ad and think, yeah, I'm ticking quite a lot of those boxes. And it's the advice I give them with our modules as well. Focus on what you do know or what you do have rather than what you don't have, and you'll be much more positive going into it.
Again, another question from the floor. what is the implication of all this, for the students coming from disadvantaged background, BAME students? What are the consequences for them, this whole new era of online teaching, and what can we do about it? Dean?
I mean, I've worked both at Russell Group and post-92 universities, and I think what this debate today allows me to think about a little bit more is perhaps that group of students that we do struggle to engage with and develop an empathy with economics and actually develop a sort of a passion. In other words, problem-based approach to economics, for instance, can help to connect groups of students who might feel disconnected from the subject with economics. So, you were talking about low-hanging fruit. I think problem-based learning, and I know there are a lot of resources that are being developed. I mean, I would say our textbooks do the core project is obviously a case of this. But if you are doing a more applied approach and you have students going, that they're talking about things that I recognize that actually look like things in my life. And with all due respect, when you take a very technical nuts bolt approach, I think developing that empathy, both with your students, but more importantly, perhaps in this context, with the students, with us and our discipline, I think that can help. Because there are many sort of issues around economics and its appeal. Okay, so you've been talking about particular ethnicities, but equally I think there's a gender issue as well. So I do think a more applied problem-based approach to the teaching of economics can create this empathy with our subject and understanding. If students can see the relevance of something to their everyday lives, it interests them. They're more inquisitive, and I think one of the key employability skills that does need further work on is this sort of inquisitiveness, this sort of research ethic, and that's true, isn't it, if you're going to become a researcher too. So I think it can have real positive benefits. When we do graduate development programs at the Treasury, one of the things the Treasury speaker always says, and again, Clodagh was talking about how you can use alumni and sort of role models, but if you're getting key speakers at the Treasury saying we want students to be coming to deal with real world issues who may have experience either themselves or through their communities, that's what we're looking for. We're looking for more creative thinking, students who are willing to think outside the box, outside of perhaps traditional approaches. Again, I think if you can show that to students, I think that can have positive benefits as well.
Thank you. Clodagh, let me put a different question to you. In order to summarize our very good discussion so far, big themes, we all agree that this is an important issue, employability skills, and we all agree that is now even more important than before given the job market. And we all talked about obstacles being institutional, ref, and cultural. We never left school, unlike you. Now, let me relate to you. Working as your colleague, I know, Clodagh, you had many successes regarding the low-hanging fruit. And could you give us some tips of how you sell it to the other colleagues? Because I assume that the main obstacle is really internal. Could you give us really, really specific, ways of selling this to others?
So I think there's the ideal world where you have a head of department who tells everybody they have to do this, and we don't have that. So I found that the best way was to sit down with people one-on-one and to understand their module as it exists at the moment, and to work with them to find easy things that they could weave in. So some modules just lend themselves completely to applied policy examples. Some you struggle a bit more with. So persuading, like an econometrics lecturer to do a project, but then you have to sort of say to him, this is how to use your TA, so it's not that much effort for you. This is how to market easily, really structuring it for them so it's low effort, persuade them that it's going to help with student satisfaction, but it doesn't always. And I think that's really important. So my satisfaction scores are not the best in the department, as you know, Ramin, but they're, you know, they were fine. But the feedback I get 2 years after people graduate is amazing. So students don't recognize at the time the value of what they're doing. So, I mean, telling people those stories, but I've put lecturers in touch with employers, with alumni, because they just couldn't, you know, I have the connections, they don't. So all of it's, but I think the one-on-one hand holding basically is what had to be done in the context of their courses.
Dean, is the situation better in the business school?
I think it is, because I think business schools traditionally have a more employer-focused outlook or greater contacts with. And I must admit that during my career, it has been working in business schools where I think they have, in the main, I don't know if others would agree, I think they have often dragged very reluctant economic departments into thinking more about employability, or at previous places I've worked offering placement opportunities. So I think it does have a positive sort of demonstration effects from other business school disciplines. And I do think we have been a little bit slow, and I think we're still very reluctant, and I agree with Claudia, it can often depend very much on the management of your department. So I think there is a positive demonstration effect, definitely. Remain, absolutely agree with you on that one.
I think one of the things that the Economics Network project showed as well was there are universities who are trying to get up the employability rankings and trying to make it their sales pitch and putting huge amount of effort and resource into it. But the other thing that, so we had a focus group discussion at Aston with lots of universities, but a penny kind of dropped with the people in Aston, if that's fair to say, amongst economics, of they realized that in Aston, everybody has to go out in a placement visit. So everybody has some connection with employers. In our university, our placement degree is very small, and only one of us goes out on placement visits. So it's just little things like that, that although you don't realize it, that everybody doing something around it and everybody manages some of the placement students, makes that connection happen. Even if they want to spend 90% of their time on their research, they sort of have to have that experience.
Rama, would you like to go?
Yeah, thank you. So thanks, guys. This was really useful and helpful, and everything. I can. So two things really. So one was a question from Tim on YouTube, which has kind of been answered, but I just wanted to sort of bring it up again, that the kind of didactic teaching that's very common, and that's kind of the default in econ, it almost sets us up for failure in terms of these skills, because you're telling people, sit there, I will tell you, listen, memorize, and you know, we're shooting ourselves in the foot, because they know that that's what they're expected to do. So, you know, it's that's where we start off from. But at the same time, because there is such a big tradition doing that, and this is kind of my own question added on to this, I mean, just to play devil's advocate, I think there is a lot of effort and resources required to change from that. Because like Claudia was saying, you need to practice, you need to be confident in yourself when you're doing these things in your class and your assessment and so on. You need to get students on board, and of course, students don't like it. So there's various kinds of resources, resource costs, basically. The, you know, somewhat unpopularity because you're pushing the boundaries for the students, more time required to develop, test, all of those things. And then for the lecturers themselves, I think someone said on here, we weren't trained in this way to have these kinds of skills. We were told, you do the hard math, that's the thing that's most important to do. So lots of costs. How do we go about, you know, coming away from the fact that it's actually, you know, some things might be, there's low-hanging fruit, easy to do. Many things will be costly. And this is not a situation right now where anyone is spending any money or resources. If I'm a head of department who, on the one hand, is sympathetic to everything you're saying, on the other hand, have been told you cannot, you know, you're belt tightening, basically. What do I do?
So I think,
yeah, could you be, yeah, Claudia, very short, please. Thank you.
I mean, the short answer is yes, it takes effort and it takes costs and it takes knowledge. I think the moves to adaptable learning are really going to help here, because I think as people are thinking about how to change things and how they teach and how they assess, people like Dean and I and other people need to sort of swoop in and help. But the only thing I would say is for a lot of it, you have to recognize that there's a sunk cost, but it does pay off. So the guy who's been teaching the same 2-hour lecture for the last 20 years, yes, he's going to have to put in effort to changing things, but some of that effort can be reused again and again and again. My only caveat to that is if you really want to keep it real, you do need to update. And I think, so, you know, it does need that persuasion that it's worth it, and that's difficult.
Okay, let me, before going to Dean, Steph, would you like to open your mic?
Yes, so my question goes back to the widening participation part. Well, of course, as many of you know, we had a widening participation seminar last week. And what we noticed is one of the difficulties that we have attracting students into economics is that perhaps students don't see the direct, I study economics, I can do all these jobs. And back to the placement year that some universities offer, some don't. Do you think that actually opening up that placement can help us to attract students, more students from underrepresented backgrounds into economics?
Dean?
I think there are 2 or 3 issues there. I think that economics certainly has a lot to do and a lot to learn in engaging not just more diverse groups in terms of ethnicity, gender, but I go back to something Andy Haldane at the Bank of England wrote. He argues that one of the big problems with economists is that we put this barrier down, and we do it for good reasons, because we're quite often, as academics, we're quite defensive and we want to show that we're good and have this academic prowess and talent. But the fact that we can't communicate perhaps as effectively with the wider public then creates a distrust of economics. I think it also creates a phobia. Okay, and I think those sort of interact, and Andy Haldane calls it the twin deficit. So I think this move that we're talking about today to try and foster these skills, but also create an empathy with our discipline, which we do through application, don't we? We do through problems, real world cases. I think that will help to break down this barrier and perhaps bring in different groups, different backgrounds, students are perhaps more creative ordinarily in their thinking. I think that's a big challenge that we face. So I would like to perhaps stress the importance of developing through these employability skills a greater empathy with our discipline and the benefits that will give.
Okay, let's go to the final part of our session, where I ask our 2 speakers to gather their thoughts on all the things we discussed. 2 minutes each. Cluda, would you like to go first, please?
Yes, thank you. So I've brought some posters because Ramin's very fond of these, but you can't see them with my backdrop. So I have 2 messages. The first one is stay real, and the second one is stay connected. The third one's probably stay at home, but ignore that one for the moment. So staying real, I mean, anything you teach, you should lead with the real world. So obviously we know this is kind of the principle of core. So give the real world example first so that everyone can put the content into context. To make it relevant, if you know that you've got students from lots of different disciplines or different types of backgrounds, make it relevant to them so that it makes sense. Why am I learning this indifference curve analysis? They won't understand that unless they have some real world context to it. And then connect your assessment to the real world. So make them realize that understanding the real world matters, because what they care about is assessment. Including, for me, communications with non-academic audience is a key part of any assessment. I think the stay real is also about being realistic. Being realistic about how much you and your students can do in 10 or 12 weeks or whatever you have. They're not going to come out as managers of Deloitte here. They're going to be ready to start work. And I do believe in less is more. in this sense. So don't try and cover the whole textbook. You probably, although there's not a huge trade-off between content and skill development, you do need to give time to the skill development. So I think that's important. I already mentioned earlier, be realistic about what you expect your students to already know and be willing to do. You're going to have to teach and guide them how to work in a team, how to talk to each other, how it's okay to talk to each other. On the stay connected, I think there's various levels to this, and obviously it's hugely important now with any online moves. So for me, I'm a human being, and it's really important to me that I connect with my students. And for that, doing things through dialogue and discussion in the classroom really help. And that in itself will mean that we're communicating when we're talking about the real world. I love to get them talking about examples from their own country, because I teach everything with a sort of Irish GB focus. Trying to create a community amongst your class is also really helpful. So that students talk to each other, they work together, they know that that's okay. Group assessment can help with that, but it needs to be done well. It ticks most of the employability boxes, but you have to be confident doing it. And I think the other thing on stay connected is what I already mentioned, with means that you have to keep updating it because the real world keeps changing. You know, Ramin mentioned I designed a new regulatory framework for energy networks in 2010. What Ofgem do now, they've just torn it apart. So I have to keep changing what I teach to reflect what they're actually doing rather than what I think they should be doing. But if you connect with the news, Twitter, with employers, that doesn't have to be like a huge amount of work, but I think it's just new examples and stuff. So stay real, stay connected, and stay at home.
Dean?
I wish I'd come up with an equally catchy title now. But look, I love economics. And the reason that I love economics is not necessarily about the methods of economics, though they're clearly important. Is that economics has a lot to say about the real world. And if we can do that, if we can demonstrate that you can develop a student's subject knowledge, but do it in a way which demonstrates how economists can at least, if not have the answers, but can at least address some of society's, the world's real problems, I think I'll use that E word, empathy again. I think you will develop a greater empathy. If our students come away and say, and they're quite happy to go to a pub on a Friday night and actually use the words, I'm an economist, and say it in a positive tone without feeling that they should be ashamed of admitting they're economists, then I think we'll have achieved something. So can I end by just saying, let's get our students to love economics in the way hopefully all we do.
Oh,
I have to say that used to be how we'd clear a room in a pub, get a table in a pub when we worked in consultancy. Was standing, if somebody said, what do you do? Say, we're economists. And they'd move and we get a table.
Wonderful, wonderful. And on those succinct messages, can I ask everyone to join me in giving our speakers a round of applause?
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
fun.
everyone. Really enjoyed it.
Please do follow us on Twitter and CTAL. We'll have an exciting conference coming up. And thank you for your questions and enjoy the rest of your time. Thank you.
Thanks, Ramin.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everyone.